Hi, welcome to our show again tonight, Polygamy, What Love Is This? My name is Doris Hanson, and it's my privilege to host this program and to welcome you to our show. This is where we encourage you and help you investigate the claims of early Mormonism and present-day Mormon and polygamous leaders. Our show originates from the TV20 studios in Salt Lake City, Utah. And as always, we want to welcome our viewers from the Boise, Idaho area who watches our shows on Sunday afternoon on KCLP Channel 18 from the Boise, Nampa, Idaho area. Of course, all of our previous shows can always be watched from around the world at our website on streaming video, and you can go to whatloveisthis.tv to watch them. And for answers to our top questions, you can go to our website, whatloveisthis.tv/answers. Or if you would like to receive our free resources, you can go to whatloveisthis.tv/offer. And we do have a DVD, Lifting the Veil of Polygamy, as well as a book, Is Polygamy Biblical, that we are offering, and you can find out how to receive it from that website. We do have a Life After Polygamy support group and discussion group. We meet once a month, and our next meeting is next Monday night at 6:30. That'll be July 19th at 6:30. Anyone whose lives have been affected by polygamy in any way, even if it was your great-grandparents that practiced polygamy, you're welcome to come and just have some questions answered and participate in the discussion. We have a very good time, and it's been very helpful. If you're interested, please email us for details. And for information about us, or if you're in a polygamy group and you would like to know how we can help you, you can go to our website, shieldandrefuge.org. And we want you to know that we're not here to try and convince or to force people out of polygamy groups. That is not our purpose. But we do want to help anyone, and there are many who are in polygamy groups who do want to get out, but they just don't know how to do it. So many who wish that there was a better way, but they don't know there is a better way, and there is, and we want to help you know that. We want to help you to get out when you feel trapped, and to know that we will offer a support system for you, and we'll even help you get out. Many people in polygamy groups think that they don't have a future in the group, and they're afraid of what future might hold for them if they're outside of the group. So give us a call. We have a toll-free hotline number. You can call us and just have your questions answered, or we can just chat. The number is 877-425-9993. Next week, our guest is going to be Lisa O'Neill. She has written an excellent research paper on polygamy in the Bible, and after reading the paper, I was so impressed, I told her she needed to come and talk about it on the show. So she's coming all the way from California, and she will be here to discuss the paper, and we think that you'll find some very interesting insights that she has. So please join us next week. Normally, we are a live telephone call-in show, but tonight we have pre-recorded our show, so don't call in. There's no one at the studio. We're not doing this live. If you have comments and questions about the program tonight, you can email them to us at tv@aboutpolygamy.com. Now, I want to lead into our presentation by reading an email that we received from a viewer a few weeks ago, and we do hope this email will touch many hearts. It's from a former Mormon by the name of Steve, and this is what he wrote. He said, "Hi Doris, as I exited Mormonism, I watched most of your shows. I was very betrayed by Mormonism. It left my heart broken. It left me bitter to know Mormons who I loved and respected and trusted really knew so little beyond mythology. I think most of us who leave go through a process of healing. For me, it was a long journey. For me, I believed it was going to land me as an agnostic, and I missed that hopeful feeling that religion gives us. Tonight, I read your comments and replies to viewers' emails, and something clicked. It wasn't the same. Anyone who really wants to know the truth gets it. It was a recognition that what you state about Christ and God is always so very simple, straightforward, and easy to digest. And I need to start reading the Bible again, and I thank you for it. I've heard the repeated calls from LDS members over and over again, and although I can relate to these Mormons and their fears and desires to defend their faith, it's always the same empty arguments. It's always the same naive, ill-informed, faith over fact, belief over reality, and when those fail, it's the please don't bash us routine. I was a leader and was faithful for 40 years, and yes, I knew polygamy was part of the faith, a mysterious, God-inspired thing that we need to have to later live, but needed to avoid talking about it now. I just do not understand how these callers justify lying when they know the truth. Some I know are just ignorant and happy with what they're told Mormonism is. Orson Pratt and Heber C. Kimball are my great-great-grandfathers. But I live around polygamy in southern Utah after having lived all over the United States and overseas, and it's awful. It breaks my heart. Mormons who deny polygamy came from the Mormons are guilty of complicity and duplicitous. They are enabling polygamy. They are the same people whose tolerance of this horrible practice have allowed it to continue for so long here in Utah. Mormons started polygamy and have tolerated polygamy by letting it remain in their temples, in their scriptures, by not coming clean, and by not taking actions to stop it. Mormons who can't own up to the truth and their duties as mere citizens of the free world are traitors to truth and enemies to mankind. I condemn my polygamist ancestors for what they've done. It's a responsibility not only to stop it now, but to ensure this is not repeated in the future. I apologize for my polygamous ancestors and their treatment of women and children. Keep up the good work. Don't ever let the victim Mormon weasel out of their responsibility to own polygamy as a doctrine. Thank you. Well, you know, this is from an LDS man who just discovered the truth, and so he left Mormonism and came to Christianity. It's so sad when we constantly hear fresh stories of the hurt and the pain that Mormons, including the polygamist groups, have perpetrated and inflicted on so many people. But it is so heartening and refreshing to get emails and phone calls like this, where the story ends at the foot of the cross of Jesus Christ, and truth is found and accepted, and a soul is saved. Praise God for truth, for Jesus, and for another life without Joseph. Now, earlier this year, we had the privilege of participating in the March Capstone conference held here in Salt Lake City, and so we presented a live demonstration of the 34 wives of Joseph Smith with the Tri-Grace Ministries in Ephraim, Utah. Now, we know there's many mainline LDS church members who don't really know the true history of early Mormon polygamy, and of course the polygamists know it and they're proud of it. But there's also many who totally ignore all the irrefutable evidence of Joseph Smith's polygamy, or they mimic the ostrich, keeping their head in the sand, not wanting to be confused with the facts. Tonight we are showing the DVD of a major portion of our Capstone Conference presentation, and please be advised that everything we presented is backed up by Mormon historical records. So let's take a look at the 34 Wives of Joseph Smith as presented to the Capstone Conference in March. Enjoy.
All right, what I want to do this morning is we're going to talk about Joseph Smith, and we're going to introduce to you the man that I think today they say nearly 14 million people are following, including the splinter groups that are polygamous groups, and 14 million people are following the prophet Joseph Smith Jr. Jesus warned us that there would be false prophets. Matthew 7 verses 15 through 20 says this: "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Even so, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. Therefore, by their fruits you shall know them." So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at Joseph Smith Jr. and see if he was a prophet of God or not. We're going to put the test that Jesus gave us on Joseph Smith. And to test Joseph Smith's character as a prophet of God, we're going to examine the historical facts surrounding his polygamy. And I want you to know right up front, because I want to be completely fair about this, it's not so much the polygamy itself, it's his choice in women. It's not that I want to say I approve of polygamy. I don't believe it has any place in the church age. Jesus didn't allow for that. But what we're going to be talking about is Joseph's choice in women. In the New Testament, it seems clear that Jesus and his apostles initiated safeguards to keep the practice of polygamy out of the Christian church. I don't believe, according to what Jesus taught, that it was ever God's intention. It was something that was man's invention, man's idea, and it never worked very well. And so Jesus, in the New Testament, through the apostles, condemned polygamy, didn't allow it to enter into the church age. So I want to be really clear about that. Now let's look at polygamy from an LDS perspective. And I want to show you just a little bit of some of the problem that the Mormon Church has with this whole concept of polygamy. Because in the Book of Mormon, in 1830, Joseph Smith recorded the following. It says, "The word of God burdens me because of your grosser crimes, for they seek to excuse themselves in committing whoredoms, because of the things which were written concerning David and Solomon, his son. David and Solomon truly had many wives and concubines, which thing was abominable before me, saith the Lord." So in the book of Jacob, in the book of Mormon, David and Solomon are used as the prime examples of how horrific and horrible polygamy was. All right, now, a few years later, in 1843, Joseph Smith supposedly received a revelation. Doctrine and Covenants, section 132, introduced a new and an everlasting covenant which commanded polygamy to be practiced in the church. Now, consider this contradictory statement. David also received many wives and concubines, and also Solomon, and in nothing did they sin, save in those things which they received not of me. David's wives and concubines were given unto him of me. I mean, this is as blatant a contradiction as it could possibly be between the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants. And then, again, in 1890, LDS prophet supposedly received a new revelation from God which contradicts the commandments issued in D&C 132. This new revelation is known to the LDS people, to Mormons, as the Manifesto, which banned polygamy from being practiced in the LDS Church. So from 1890 to the present, anyone practicing polygamy has been excommunicated from the church. And so you can see how the Mormon Church has flip-flopped back and forth on this topic, depending on what the prophets decided was okay for the time. And I'm glad that in the Bible we don't have that kind of flip-flop going on. In Sacred Loneliness is the book we're going to be looking at, and this was written by an LDS historian named Todd Compton, and he has the highest credentials in the Mormon Church. He is a Mormon in good standing, served a mission in Ireland, is a graduate of BYU University, was awarded a Best Book Award by a couple different organizations. He presently serves on the Board of Elders for the Journal of Mormon History. So he's a well-documented LDS historian, still in good standing with the Mormon Church. So the information we're going to share with you today is documented by Mormon historians. It's a good source, and you can come check it out later if you have any questions about that. The facts surrounding Joseph Smith polygamy, and I'm just going to give you an overview. I gave you a handout, an overview of Joseph Smith's plural wives, and this information is in this handout. Okay? A third of the wives that he married were to teenage girls, ages 14 through 19. So 11 of the marriages were to very young girls. 11 of the marriages were to women who had living husbands. He married women. Okay? This is called polyandry. One woman married to two husbands. Joseph also married two sets of young sisters. He married three sets of sisters, but two sets of young sisters. And Joseph married two sets of mothers and daughters. And so these are the historical facts surrounding Joseph Smith. And so we want to talk just briefly about why that's a problem. Okay, why is that a problem? First of all, polygamy was illegal in every state that Joseph Smith practiced plural marriage. It was illegal back then, and in 1890 that they banned polygamy was because it was illegal. So I'm wondering what the difference was. Why was it okay for Joseph Smith to break the law? There's kind of a disconnect there. Joseph Smith's apparent taste for young flesh, as he married 11 young women. And today, in the LDS Church, or in America, it's not accepted. Warren Jeffs is in prison today for this very same sin, the breaking of the law. Okay, some more problems. The problem that deals with him marrying married women. I think that's probably one of the biggest problems in his choice of women. You're going to marry somebody else's wife, and then you're going to consummate your marriage with that wife. Isn't that the exact definition of adultery? And so I think that's a problem. Todd Compton states this in case anybody wonders whether or not the LDS historians think that Joseph Smith was actually consummating his marriages. Utah Mormons, including Smith's wives, affirmed repeatedly that he had physical sexual relations with them. Therefore, there is no good evidence that he did not have sexual relations with any wife, previously single or polyandrous. And so the fact that he was with all these women is pretty much an established fact, which is a problem. Number 4, the law of God forbids marriage to a mother and a daughter. And he married 2 mothers and daughters, which is a complete breaking of the Old Testament law of God. One more significant problem is that a true prophet can't lie. Part of the puzzle for a true prophet to be able to lie. But Joseph Smith, 1 month prior to his death, he had 34 wives at that time, publicly proclaimed in a sermon that there were accusations being leveled at him in regard to his practice of polygamy that were false. He said this, "What a thing it is for a man to be accused of committing adultery and having 7 wives when I can only find 1. So that's a bold-faced lie. He had 34 wives at that time. At this time, I'm going to introduce a very good friend of mine and one who we have worked with on many occasions going into polygamous communities, and her name is Doris Hansen. And so I'm going to let Doris come up and tell you a little bit about her story. She actually was raised in a polygamous community, and her ministry is to polygamous women. So Doris, come on up. Tell them about your ministry. And I want you to notice, as Doris comes up, we have the wives and husbands of their wives of Joseph Smith coming up.
When we did this in Manti, we walked probably about 3 or 4 blocks from where the women got dressed, and they paraded down the streets of Manti and up the street and down towards where we were going to stand in front of the temple grounds, and it was an amazing visual for the people to see all these many wives walking down the street, and they all belonged to one man. These are the 34 wives of Joseph Smith and 11 husbands of the 11 married women that he married. Emma was the only legal wife that he had, and there are many people who think that he had more than 34 wives, actually. These are documented for sure, and so that's why we use the number 34. My name is Doris Hansen. I was born and raised in the Kingston Polygamy Group. I was threatened all my life that if I didn't live polygamy and accept it when I grew up, I was going to be doomed to hell and damnation for eternity. And I hated it, and I got away. I hated God for many years after I got away, but God let me run away from him long enough so I could run right into him. And I did, and I got saved. And at that time, I just had such a heart for the polygamous people, and God just kind of laid it on my heart to know that at some point in the future I was going to have a ministry to polygamists, and so I started doing things behind the scene and mailings and different things that nobody knew anything about but me. And it took 20 years, but God opened up an opportunity in 2007 when Lifting the Veil of Polygamy was released, and we opened up a ministry called a Shield and Refuge Ministry. The Shield and Refuge is that the polygamous people, I'm a missionary to the polygamists now, and the polygamous people who want to get out can know that God will be their shield and their refuge to them when they leave, and will give them a safe place to go and help them get aligned back into real society. Tonight, first of all, I want to say something that happened last night. Chip had mentioned some skeptics from a Mormon guy that wondered if anybody got out of Mormonism and were happy. Last night out in the foyer, someone came up to me and he said, does anyone ever get out of Mormonism and find happiness and find joy? And I said, good heavens, yes, my goodness. You know, if you find Jesus, you do. If you don't find Jesus, you may not. And we talked for a minute, and then he walked off, and immediately a girl came up to me and shook my hand and said, hi, how are you? She says, you know what? I was a Mormon. I got saved 6 or 8 months ago, and I'm so happy. So yes, you get joy abundantly. Tonight I want to talk about 3 of Joseph Smith's wives, and I'm going to talk first of all about Helen Mar Kimball. Helen Mar Kimball. 14-year-old Helen Mar Kimball. She was the daughter of Heber C. Kimball and was approached by 37-year-old Joseph Smith, who taught her the mysteries of celestial marriage, which is known as polygamy. Now, Joseph Smith, of course, was the founder and the leader of the Mormon Church. He was highly revered. He was respected among all the church members. He held a strong position of trust, and they believed that everything he said was from the very mouth of God. Now, the night before Joseph Smith's proposal to 14-year-old Helen Mar Kimball, her father, Heber C. Kimball, had a conversation with his daughter and asked her if she would believe him if he told her it was right for a married man to take other wives. Well, according to Helen's personal writings, she said she felt like a small earthquake had shaken her emotions. She loved her father, and she really didn't think that he would lead her wrong, but her sensibilities just kind of made it difficult for her to understand this, and she felt it very hard to believe it. She didn't know quite what to think. Well, the next morning after that, Joseph Smith arrived at the home, and he proposed to Helen Mar Kimball that day an illegal polygamous relationship, asking her to be one of his plural wives. He persuaded her to enter into a spiritual marriage, not a temporal one. Now, Helen couldn't have known at that time that her father, Heber C. Kimball, and Joseph Smith had gotten together in advance and had planned this transaction for 14-year-old Helen to become one of Joseph Smith's plural wives. She said that Joseph Smith had told her that if she would agree to this marriage, it would ensure her eternal salvation and exaltation, and that of her father's household and all of her kindred. And Helen said, quote, "This promise was so great that I willingly gave myself to purchase so glorious a reward." She actually thought that her marriage to Joseph Smith was only for eternity, and that her time in this life would be her own, and that she wouldn't belong to him here. She seemed to relish the supposed independence that taking this step apparently was promised to her. And as it turned out, she discovered that she either misinterpreted Joseph Smith's intent, or he may have purposely misled her about his intentions. She later said to a close friend, quote, "I would never have been sealed to Joseph had I known it was anything more than ceremony. I was young, and they deceived me by saying salvation of our whole family depended on it." Now, she said they deceived her. Her mother didn't deceive her. Her mother didn't have anything to do with it. Helen must have been very surprised to discover that this marriage included time as well as eternity, a physical union between this 14-year-old girl and the 37-year-old man. She hadn't even wanted to marry Joseph Smith, but she considered that it was a very small price to pay for the guarantee of her eternal life and the eternal life of the ones that she loved the most. Now, as church president, Joseph Smith was in a position of special trust, yet he practiced his deviant tendency to pedophilia, as is proven by his polygamous union, not just to one 14-year-old girl, as Chip said, but to 7 girls, 17 years old and younger, and a total of 11 girls, 20 years old and younger. Now, let's put this in a contemporary perspective. There was an article in the Deseret News last month that tells of a case of a man in American Fork accused of having a sexual relationship with a 16-year-old student. This man is a former seminary prophet. He's 37 years old. He faces 14 first-degree felony charges and 1 second-degree felony charge of several different kinds of rape and forcible sexual abuse. Prosecutors agree that the charges against him are enhanced because he held a position of trust over this young girl. He had seduced and sexually molested her under the banner of being a special and trusted spiritual leader. Now, let's compare this 37-year-old American Fork principal with 37-year-old Joseph Smith. The American Fork principal seduces a 16-year-old seminary student. Joseph Smith seduces a 14-year-old girl with an illegal polygamous union. The American Fork principal is charged with 14 first-degree felonies. Joseph Smith is considered a holy prophet of God, and no one requires any accountability from him, from his actions, either then or now. In today's courts, with the evidence that's available, Joseph Smith would have been convicted of child molestation and placed in a cell next to Warren Jeffs. On the same page here, we also don't want to leave out Heber C. Kimball. 51-year-old Warren Jeffs was tried and found guilty of doing what Heber C. Kimball did. Warren Jeffs was charged with being an accomplice to rape when he arranged the marriage of a 14-year-old girl to her cousin in the FLDS polygamy group. And this culture applauded his conviction. Yet Heber C. Kimball arranged the marriage of his 14-year-old daughter to a polygamist, and he's not held accountable either. In fact, he's called a holy apostle of God. In these two events, why wouldn't Joseph Smith be as guilty of child rape as the seminary principal? And why wouldn't Heber C. Kimball be as guilty as Warren Jeffs for arranging the marriage of his 14-year-old daughter? Helen Mar Kimball became a widow just 1 year later when Joseph Smith was murdered in 1844. She was then free to be romanced by and to be married by her longtime heartthrob, Horace Whitney. Sadly, however, after they moved to Utah, her husband, Horace Whitney, took 2 polygamous wives. And by that time, Helen was firmly accepting of and a hearty advocate of plural marriage. What I find heart-wrenching in these accounts of Joseph Smith's method of gathering to himself these plural wives is that he consistently brought God into the proposition. Having been born and raised in a polygamist home myself, I'm painfully aware of the use that they have when they use God in the teachings and threatenings of living polygamy. We were constantly threatened that we comply or be damned, accept polygamy or be destroyed, which is what Joseph Smith said in section 132. We were conditioned from the cradle when we grew up believing that it was God's requirement to become a plural wife. We were brainwashed. We were frightened into accepting it. So I can understand being born and raised with a polygamous mindset when that's all you've known since birth. It's natural to believe it. But none of the plural wives of Joseph Smith and these early Mormons were born and raised in a polygamy culture. They had not been brainwashed from birth like we were. Polygamy was not something they were familiar with. It had nothing to do with salvation as far as they knew up until that point. Yet they believed what Joseph Smith claimed, that it was a holy principle and required by God. Sadly, they didn't study their Bible about it either, and even if they had, would they have been able to discern the truth that God really never required polygamy? And most alarming to me is that many of these women hesitated at first, like Helen Mar Kimball did, but later agreed to become a plural wife simply because she trusted the spiritual leadership of the Mormon Church. Several of these ladies asked God for confirmation. And they received some alarmingly profound spiritual experiences confirming to them that they were to embrace plural marriage, and so they did with all their heart and soul. Of course, we know that feelings are not a barometer for truth, and spiritual experiences are not always from God. Some of these who did receive the spiritual manifestations were among those who became polygamy's most powerful advocates. Helen Mar Kimball had said that polygamy was a small price to pay for the salvation of her loved ones. I wonder if she ever found out in later years that Jesus paid the price for salvation and no one else can.
Well, as you can imagine, there's 34 women up here, but there's also 11 men. And for these men, polygamy was a great pain for them as well. Created all kinds of turmoil inside of them and problems for them. I want to introduce to you Miranda Johnson. Miranda, you step forward. And Miranda and her family in 1833 moved to Kirtland, Ohio, where she met a dynamic young Mormon convert named Orson Hyde. Dynamic young Orson Hyde, step forward there. Okay. The next year, Miranda and Orson were married, and in 1835, just a short time after their marriage, Orson was ordained an apostle of the LDS Church. And just so for your information, in the early Mormon Church, the 12 apostles were traveling missionaries, which meant that Miranda spent a great time alone in her first years of marriage. So she wasn't with Orson a lot because he was on his mission for the church. Evidently, Orson struggled with this situation as well. And in 1838, he disaffected from the LDS Church. And he wrote the infamous accusation that if Joseph Smith was not stopped, he would, quote unquote, be a second Muhammad to this generation. In 1839, however, he moved back to far west Missouri, a repentant, humbled man, and wanted to return to the church. A year later, Orson and Elder John E. Page were sent on a mission to Jerusalem. Can you imagine that? Back in the early 1800s, going on a mission to Jerusalem. In October of 1841, Orson Hyde stood on the Mount of Olives and consecrated Palestine for the gathering of Judah in the last days. And I actually visited his park that's set up there, the Hyde Park that's set up in honor of Orson Hyde traveling all the way to Jerusalem in the early 1800s. While Orson was on his mission, however, as he was returning from Jerusalem, Joseph Smith took Miranda as one of his polygamous wives. So while he was gone, without his knowledge, Joseph convinced Miranda, who was a hot, young pioneer woman, to be one of his wives. Okay? Now, we know she was hot because you're going to find out later that other men were after her. Okay? So, while Orson was on his mission, Joseph Smith married her. She was 26 at the time, and Joseph was 36. And we can only guess at the shock of this that this exposure to polygamy was for her, not to mention the fact that she was also entering into a polyandrous state where she already had a husband. It must have given Miranda great turmoil in her own soul. Todd Compton says that nearly everyone who has commented on their first introduction to polygamy wrote that they at first looked at it with revulsion and shock and fought the idea for a time. As Miranda was apparently in love with Orson Hyde, polyandry must have been enormously difficult for her. She and Orson had a good relationship when they were together, and so there was no reason to think that she was dissatisfied with her relationship with Orson. Although there were conflicting reports as to exactly what happens, it seems most likely that Orson did not know of the marriage, and it was reported that he was extremely upset upon coming home from his mission to learn that Miranda had married Smith in his absence. So, men, can you imagine, going on a mission, a significant mission for your church, and coming home and finding out that your young bride is now the wife of the prophet of your church? Shocking, would be a shocking thing. Orson, however, did not stop living with Miranda at this time. He accepted, because he accepted Joseph Smith as a religious leader, accepted the relationship and the situation, and he continued to live with her. Miranda continued to have children with Orson until 1858, so they lived together for a long time. Before his death, in 1878, Orson also married 8 additional wives and fathered 32 children. So Orson bought into the polygamy idea and became a part of that as well.
Next, I want to talk about Joseph Smith's wives number 20 and 21, the Partridge sisters. It's probably impossible to find a polygamy group anywhere that would prohibit a man from marrying sisters as plural wives. It isn't unusual for a man to marry both a mother and a daughter. I'd like to read from Leviticus 18, just a couple of verses. It says, "Do not have sexual relations with both a woman and her daughter. It is wickedness." Verse 18, "Do not take your wife's sister as a rival wife and have sexual relations with her while your wife is living." Joseph Smith set the precedence in Mormon polygamy for violating these particular commands in Leviticus 18. He did marry mother and daughter, and he was guilty of marrying 4 sets of sisters as plural wives. The Lawrence sisters, the Huntington sisters, the Johnson sisters, and the Partridge sisters, and they're the ones I'm going to focus on now. There's 22-year-old Eliza and 19-year-old Emily. He married the younger one, Emily, first on March 4th of 1843, which was the day that he married teenage girl, 19-year-old Flora Woodworth. Same day, 2 girls the same day, 19 years old. And 4 days later, he married Emily, Emily's older sister, Eliza, who was 22 years old. So in 4 days, Joseph Smith took 3 young brides, 2 of them 19 and 1 of them 22, and he was 37 years old at the time. The sisters had known Joseph Smith since 1831. He had baptized their father into the Mormon church, Edward. In fact, Edward became the very first Mormon bishop. In 1840, their father died. Their mother remarried a widower, and that widower just happened to be the father of the Huntington sisters, whom Joseph Smith also took as spiritual wives. At the time of their father's death, Emily and Eliza went to live in the Smith home. The sisters helped Emma out. They were babysitters. They helped her out with the housework. And they also came increasingly to the attention of the roving eye of their benefactor, Joseph Smith. Emma was very kind to the sisters, and no doubt she was very grateful for their help. Emily said that Emma was a very kind, good, and noble woman until polygamy came in the picture. There must have been a severe change in Emily, and I can understand that, as she found her husband increasingly dabbling in polygamy, which would be, I know it's hard to take, I've seen it. The sisters were comfortable. They were content living at the Smith home. At least in the beginning, they would go horseback riding and have parties with people their own age. But in the spring of 1842, the warmth of their living arrangement diminished when Joseph Smith set his sights on these 2 girls as potential celestial mates. Joseph approached Emily first. She was alone in the room, and he told her that if she could keep a secret, he would tell her something for her benefit. She assured him that she could keep a secret, but there was no opportunity for him to talk to her at that point. So he said, "If I wrote you a letter, will you promise to burn the letter after you read it?" Well, there's a red flag. But she said she would, but then she later regretted it, being sure that this wasn't proper. So she told him that she could not take the personal letter from him and to let the matter drop. So Joseph Smith didn't approach her again till her 19th birthday. But by that time, rumors had been flying around Nauvoo about the very subject that Joseph Smith wanted to talk to her about, and that was polygamy. One of Joseph Smith's plural wives was a Mrs. Elizabeth Durfee. Is she here? Mrs. Durfee. Well, she married Joseph Smith as a polygamous wife. She was 50 years old when she married Joseph Smith, and he was only 36. But Joseph Smith frequently would call on the older women like that to come and prepare some of the young girls for plural marriage to him. And she, Mrs. Durfee, was already married and living with another husband when Smith married her. Well, one day, Mrs. Durfee came and visited Emily and explained that Smith wanted to talk to her. Mrs. Durfee said she thought he wanted her to become his wife, and by now Emily had been mentally prepared for such a request. Well, along with Mrs. Durfee, Joseph Smith had also used Heber C. Kimball in his schemes to acquire wives. And so one day, Mrs. Durfee invited Emily to go to Heber C. Kimball's home. Emily had been helping Emma out with the laundry all day long, but she went ahead and went to visit the Kimball home anyway, still wearing her work clothes that she'd been doing laundry in all day. Joseph Smith was there, and he told her what he had wanted to say earlier, and that was he taught her the principle of plural marriage. He said this principle had been revealed to him, and he asked her if she would marry him, and she consented on the spot, and they were married then and there. Her old dirty work clothes was her wedding gown, and Heber C. Kimball performed the marriage. Joseph then went home his way, and Emily went home her way, and they both went home to the same residence. She later remarked this was a strange way to get married. Now, Eliza didn't know Emily had married Joseph Smith, but Emily knew Eliza could keep a secret, and so she told her about it afterwards. And then Joseph approached Eliza and taught her the plan of celestial marriage and asked her to marry him, and she agreed. But she said later, quote, "It was a hard trial for me, but I had the most implicit confidence in him." 4 days later, she became his bride. As you can imagine, Emma Smith, his one and only legal wife, was also aware of the rumors that were going around. Smith was trying to talk Emma into going into plural marriage, and she didn't want to do it. And finally, after a couple of months, she told Joseph Smith that she indeed would allow him to take a plural wives if she could pick his wives, 2 of his wives for him. And lo and behold, she picked Eliza and Emily for Joseph Smith to marry, not even knowing that he had married them 2 months ago. So a second plural marriage ceremony took place, and Emma never knew about the first one. She had no way of knowing. And Emily said, "From that hour, Emma was our bitter enemy. We remained in their house for several months, but things went from bad to worse. And after some troubling times, Emily finally brought it to an end. One day she sent for the sisters, and as they came into the room, they could tell that something was wrong, and Emma clearly was in command, and Joseph was looking much like a martyr. Emma was upset, and she said some very harsh words. She demanded that the plural marriages end, they be terminated, they find other husbands, and she said that Joseph must give up the girls or blood would flow. But she didn't say whose blood. Well, the girls were indignant that Joseph Smith didn't stick up for them, but later on they understood why he couldn't have done that. And after Joseph Smith was martyred, Eliza and her sister Carolyn married Amasa Lyman. Emily married Brigham Young, and they all migrated west. Emily died at age 75, Eliza died at 65, and she remained a defender of polygamy all her life.
Right. Isn't this, I've heard this a lot. It's just almost too bizarre to believe, isn't it? I want to introduce to you Henry Jacobs and his wife that he married, Zena Huntington. They married in 1841, and she lived with him until 1846. She bore him 2 children. Shortly after their marriage, however, Joseph Smith approached the newlywed couple. He knew Zena as a young girl and maybe had introduced the idea of plural marriage to her at that time. But he approached her and asked if they would consider this celestial marriage contract. He said that the Lord had made it known to him that she, Zena, was to be his celestial wife. Joseph, however, told them that they could continue to live together as husband and wife. So he talked the couple into doing this. Surprisingly, Henry accepted this, but Zena struggled with the news. Zena remained conflicted until October, when Joseph sent a message to her stating that he would lose his position as prophet and his life if she did not become one of his plural wives. So what kind of pressure is that to put on a young girl? Zena finally acquiesced. She was married to the prophet in October of 1841. Henry knew of the marriage and accepted it. He believed that whatever the prophet did was right. So Henry accepted this relationship, a polyandrous relationship with Zina, until the death of the prophet in 1844. So she was wife to both husbands until 1844. Following the prophet's death, one would think that Henry and Zina's marital situation should have simplified a bit, because Joseph Smith is now out of the picture. She and Henry, who had never stopped living together as husband and wife, probably expected to continue doing so now without a third member of the marriage triangle. However, it was shortly after Joseph's death that Brigham Young approached Zina, and she married him for time in September of 1844. It was a very bizarre ceremony. It would be too long to read to you this morning. Nonetheless, she remained married and cohabiting with Henry. It was not until 1846 that Zina and Henry's relationship officially ended. While Henry was on a mission for the church in England, Zina wrote him a letter telling him that she was now living with Brigham Young and no longer considered Henry to be her husband. Henry returned from his mission and settled in California. It's kind of interesting, on their trip out west, he tagged along kind of behind the wagon train, and just the stories of that are really heart-wrenching. He was heartbroken that his wife had rejected him from being her husband, and couldn't understand it. He then later moved to California, but he was still in love with Zina, now one of the plural wives of Joseph Smith, Brigham Young. Henry's letters to his wife Zina were heartrending. On September 2nd, 1852, he wrote, "Oh, how happy I should be if I only could see you and the little children, bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. I am unhappy." Henry lamented, "There is no peace for poor me. My pleasure is you. My comfort has vanished. O Zina, will I ever get you again? Answer the question, please." And the answer was no. He never was able to see his wife again.
And the final story tonight, I want to talk about Lucy Walker, Joseph Smith's 23rd wife, his 22nd plural wife. Lucy Walker, 17 years old. Lucy was sealed to Joseph Smith one day after her 17th birthday, and he was 37 years old, more than twice her age. So again, we see that Joseph Smith is attracted to and taking young teenage girls as plural wives. Lucy's father was converted to Mormonism when she was just 6 years old, and her mother was converted 3 years. Eventually, the Walkers moved to Illinois. Lucy's mother died in January of 1882, and then not long after her mother died, Joseph Smith moves in for the manipulation here and sends Lucy's father away on a mission, denying both the father and the children proper grieving time. 3 months later, when Lucy's 15 years old, she and her brother are invited to move into the Smith's home. Lucy was once asked how many people lived in the Smith home, and she said the Lawrence sisters were living there, the Partridge sisters were living there, plus herself, and there was some domestic help. This was very convenient for Smith to invite these young marriageable girls to move in and live with him under the guise of benevolence, and it's very odd how so many of them became his plural wives. Joseph Smith proposed to Lucy while she was staying at the Smith home, and she said that he asked to talk with her and told her, "I have a message for you. I have been commanded by God to take another wife, and you are the woman." Lucy said this announcement struck her like a thunderbolt. He proceeded to ask her if she believed if he was a prophet of God. She answered, well, yes, most assuredly she believed he was. So he moved forward at that point to teach her the principle of plural marriage. He promised that it would form a chain that would never be broken, worlds without ends. He asked what she thought about the idea, and she hesitated. How could she speak? She didn't have a mother to turn to. She didn't have a father for counsel or advice. She had no one to ask. So Joseph Smith offered some gentle persuasion. He promised Lucy, Although I cannot, under existing circumstances, acknowledge you as my wife, the time is near when we will go beyond the Rocky Mountains, and then you will be acknowledged and honored as my wife. He played upon her sorrow and her sense of aloneness, but then moved in for the decisive blow. He warned her there was a time limit in which she had to respond. This was a command from God. He would give her until tomorrow to decide, and if she rejected this message, the gate would be closed against her forever. Well, Lucy had some spunk, and she fumed at this high-handed and threatening treatment. And she said this aroused the very Scotch in her brains, or in her veins. And she stood toe-to-toe to Smith, looked him right straight in the face, and she said she required a revelation before she would submit to this proposition. Well, he promised her that if she would pray, she would receive her own personal manifestation from God. And so she did. And she did. She said she spent a restless, sleepless night until early morning dawn drew near, and she got her answer. She said a heavenly influence and feeling of supreme happiness took possession of her. She gave no other details about her spiritual experience, but this was evidently enough for her, and she told Joseph Smith yes, she would marry him. And on May 1st of 1843, while Emma was away shopping in St. Louis, they got married. The only witness was Eliza Partridge, and William Clayton officiated. Lucy continued to live in the Smith home without Emma even ever knowing about the connection with polygamy with them. In fact, one day, in a very pitiful statement was made to Lucy by Emma. Emma said she hoped that Lucy would never make a married woman unhappy by marrying her husband. There's volumes in that. Lucy Walker considered it was her duty to give herself up as a sacrifice to polygamy to help establish celestial marriage on the earth. The sacrificial duty was part of the brainwashing technique. I'm here to tell you, I've seen it a lot. Lucy had been sworn to secrecy about her marriage to Smith, and she'd never witnessed a secret plural marriage herself of others, and Emma knew nothing about the marriage either. So she certainly didn't give her consent like Section 132 said it was supposed to. So these deceits and secrecies are inherent in the practice of polygamy groups. At one time, Joseph Smith introduced Lucy to Heber C. Kimball and Brigham Young as his wife, but very few people really knew about it, and she went by the name of Lucy Walker. Someone once asked her if she knew of any children fathered by Joseph Smith, and she declined to answer the question. After Joseph Smith's death, as happened to many of the widows, Lucy Walker was married to Heber C. Kimball, and Brigham Young performed the ceremony. Lucy traveled west with Heber C. Kimball and with several of Smith's wives. She had 9 children with Heber C. Kimball, but only 5 survived. She died in Salt Lake City in 1910 at the age of 84. Although many of Joseph Smith's wives seem to be kind and thoughtful and caring women, I can't help but reflect at the frustrations and the loneliness they suffered all the days of their lives as mere plural wives. You see, my father was a polygamist. He only had 2 wives. My mother was his second wife. Yet I vividly remember her tears, sometimes emotional outbursts, which at the time I didn't understand. I remember one day as a child I snuck into her private diary. There were no private information there. She was just writing down her feelings, her tireless efforts of trying to make God pleased with her, and her sacrificial attitude towards life, which the life of polygamy demands. Yet she deemed it worth it. And I don't wonder that many of these polygamist women of early Mormonism would have had the same sacrificial martyr complex that my own mother had. In their minds, they were building treasure for heaven. The painful sacrificial life of polygamy here was building that for them. They lived hard for their beliefs, and it was a very hard life. I remember how difficult it was as a child growing up in a poverty-stricken polygamist home, but that was nothing compared to the rough pioneer life of early Mormon polygamist women. How sad to realize that when they did die, they didn't wake up in heavenly glory to be reunited with their polygamist husband who had been crowned as a God in glory. But instead, each one of them had to face holy and Almighty God with the question, what did you do with Jesus? What a tragedy that they all lived and died believing that their human husband was their Savior. And that's the story of Lucy Walker. Thank you so much for inviting us here tonight, or today, and we do hope that we helped you understand Mormon polygamy.
I want to ask you guys to be praying for us. Next week, we will be going to 2 polygamous compounds with a mission team from LeTourneau University. Doris will be joining us for those trips. And just keep us in your prayers. There's a lot of unknowns when you go into those compounds. We've never had a problem. Doesn't mean there never could be a problem. So just keep us in your prayers. Pray mostly that the Lord will open the hearts and the eyes of some of these women to contact Doris and to be rescued out of these situations. So thank you again. Thank you, women and men, for joining us. We appreciate it.
You know, we hope you enjoyed the presentation of the 34 wives of Joseph Smith. Again, we want to say it was all based on history's records. I want to close by talking again about grace and works. We've discussed the biblical truth many times in the past shows that no one will earn eternal glory through their own good works. Ephesians 2 verse 9 tells us one reason why, so that no one will boast. Can you imagine heaven filled with people prancing around like strutting roosters, bragging each above the other, describing the wonderful works they did to get there? Joseph Smith displayed a great example of that arrogance when he boasted that he did greater works than even Jesus did. God will not tolerate or give any of us the opportunity to boast that we did one single thing to earn our salvation. He did all the works and He gets all the glory. We're saved by grace through faith. Saving faith is described in 1 Peter 1:7 as being more precious than pure gold, and verse 9 tells us that the result of our faith is salvation. No wonder it's so precious. The Bible does talk about works, but never in the context of earning salvation, but as a result of being saved. God's gift of eternal life and eternal glory is ours only when we believe in and receive by faith Jesus Christ and the works He did on the cross for us. He has already paid it all. So we suggest that you choose the truth and submit to God's way, and Jesus is God's only way, not polygamy, not your church, not your works. We want to thank you for watching Polygamy, What Love Is This tonight. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope to see you again next week as we look at Lisa O'Neill's story on polygamy. God bless you and good night.